Thank you so much for attending my PowerPoint presentation on World of Warcraft's worst classes. First up is Windwalker Monk. The Windwalker Monk is a melee DPS specialization that focuses on converting energy into chi and using that chi to deal damage while maintaining exceptional mobility. This is the theory, anyway. In practice, Windwalker is a spec so unremarkable that most players have genuinely forgotten it exists in the game. If you run low to mid Mythic Plus keys, you will almost never see a monk, let alone a Windwalker specifically. This isn't because the spec is prohibitively difficult or requires some esoteric knowledge to play correctly. It's because Windwalker historically lags behind other specs in raid performance and offers so little justification for its existence that bringing one is essentially a charitable act. The utility problem is particularly fascinating. At face value, Ring of Peace is one of the best area denial spells in the game. Leg Sweep is a reliable AoE stun. Paralysis can function as an enrage dispel or long-term crowd control. Mystic Touch provides a physical damage, increasing debuff. These tools sound impressive until you realize that most of them are available to all monk specializations, not just Windwalker. This makes it extraordinarily difficult to justify bringing a Windwalker specifically for utility when Brewmaster and Mistweaver can provide the same benefits while actually fulfilling their roles competently. You're not bringing unique value. You're bringing a worse version of tools other people already have. The defensive situation somehow manages to be even more embarrassing. In the Midnight pre-patch, Windwalker's defensive abilities drop to exactly two options: Fortifying Brew and Touch of Karma. That's it. Those are your survival tools. Diffuse Magic was absorbed into Fortifying Brew rather than existing as its own ability, which I'm sure felt like a great consolidation to someone at Blizzard who doesn't understand that reducing options isn't the same as improving gameplay. Storm, Earth, and Fire was completely replaced with Zenith, fundamentally altering how the spec functions, which would be exciting if anyone actually cared enough to notice. But here's the thing, players do try Windwalker occasionally, usually because they find Mistweaver appealing and accidentally fall into playing DPS while questing. The consistent community response is always some variation of "what am I missing?" The answer, of course, is nothing. You're not missing anything. The spec is simply invisible in relevant content because it offers middling damage, non-unique utility, and the weakest defensive profile of any DPS class. Tier lists consistently rank Windwalker as low to middling, which is generous considering how rarely anyone actually encounters one in the wild. Next up is Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest is a ranged DPS specialization that converts insanity into void form damage windows while managing damage overtime effects across multiple targets. This specialization has been a perennial underperformer across multiple expansions, which is a polite way of saying Shadow Priest has been objectively terrible for years, and Blizzard has simply chosen not to address this. According to simulation data, Windwalker monks average 4.43% more single target DPS than Shadow Priests. Let that marinate for a second. The spec we just discussed, the one that's so invisible in content that players genuinely forget it exists, performs better than Shadow Priest in the one area where Shadow theoretically should excel. But don't worry, it gets worse. When simulating for light AOEDPS potential with small waves of adds, Windwalker monks average 25.37% more DPS than Shadow Priests. You are losing to a mobility-focused melee spec in AoE damage by over a quarter. The spec whose primary identity is we move fast and punch things is outperforming you in multi-target scenarios by a margin so substantial that it borders on comedic. This isn't a minor tuning issue. This is a fundamental design failure that has persisted across patches despite the community being completely unsatisfied going into every single expansion. The most insulting part about Shadow Priest's current state is how it's used as the comparison point for other struggling specs. When Windwalker players wanted to express their dissatisfaction during Shadowlands, the forum post was titled "Windwalker are literally worse than Shadow Priests," as if being worse than Shadow Priest represents some unprecedented level of incompetence. You have become the baseline measurement for failure. You are the unit of measurement other terrible specs use to quantify their own inadequacy. Congratulations on achieving a level of mediocrity so consistent that you've been immortalized as the standard for at least "we're not that bad." The community cares more about literally any other spec's complaints, because Shadow Priest complaints are just background noise at this point. Everyone knows Shadow is underperforming. Everyone knows the design issues persist across patches. The difference is that other specs occasionally get attention, whereas Shadow Priest players have simply accepted their role as the forgotten stepchild of WoW's DPS hierarchy. There's also a delightful irony in playing a Shadow specialization that still casts holy spells, but honestly, thematic consistency is the least of your problems when Windwalker monks are doing your job better than you. Moving on to Feral Druid. Feral Druid is a melee DPS specialization that transforms into cat form to generate energy, convert that energy into combo points, and spend those combo points on finisher abilities while maintaining bleeds and managing cooldowns across a priority system that requires you to track approximately 18 different things simultaneously. The reward for mastering this complexity is performance that can charitably be described as middling, and more accurately described as why are you doing this to yourself? When simulating for light AOE potential, enhancement shamans average 37.3% more DPS than feral druids. You are losing to enhancement shaman in multi-target scenarios by over a third. Enhancement shaman, a spec we'll discuss in detail later, but I'll spoil it now. Enhancement is historically one of the worst specializations in World of Warcraft's entire 20-year history, but here's your consolation prize. When simulating for maximum theoretical single-target DPS, feral druids average 9.77% more DPS than enhancement shamans. Congratulations. Your big accomplishment, the thing you can hang your hat on after spending hours practicing your rotation and managing your energy pooling and tracking your rip duration and monitoring your savage roar uptime and planning your berserk windows, is that you beat enhancement shaman by less than 10% in single target damage. The community consensus is that a good feral druid will beat an enhancement shaman at the same gear and skill level, which is the kind of achievement that really makes you question your life choices. The complexity to output ratio is genuinely baffling. Feral has a reputation for being harder to play than enhancement, which would be fine if the difficulty curve resulted in proportionally higher damage. It does not. You are performing a significantly more complicated rotation to achieve results that are worse in half the content and barely better in the other half. The energy and combo point management system functions as intended, meaning it requires constant attention and planning, which you dutifully provide, and then you look at the damage meter and realize that the marksmanship hunter, who's been watching YouTube videos during the fight, is doing twice your damage. There's also a fundamental identity crisis happening with the shape-shifting fantasy. You transform into a feral cat, an apex predator, a creature of primal savagery and untamed ferocity. And then you spend the entire encounter managing debuff timers, like you're doing spreadsheet maintenance. The historical cat do EPS memes exist for a reason. Players have been making jokes about feral's inadequacy since vanilla, and 20 years later, the punchline is still landing because nothing has fundamentally changed. You are more complex than you need to be and less effective than you should be, which is a truly impressive combination of design failures. Next up is Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock is a ranged DPS specialization that applies damage over time effects across multiple targets, maintains these effects through complex refresh mechanics, and converts soul shards into burst windows while managing a priority system that assumes encounters last long enough for your DOTs to actually matter. According to Raider.io statistics from Dragonflight, Affliction Warlock was one of 4 specs actively competing to replace Survival Hunter as the worst specialization in the game. This is not a competition you want to win. This is not a category where second place is acceptable. And yet Affliction managed to distinguish itself as having such abysmal representation in Mythic Plus dungeons that the data suggests little to no players are actually subjecting themselves to this experience. The fundamental problem is that Affliction is a damage over time specialization in a burst damage meta. You spend the first 15 seconds of every encounter applying agony, corruption, unstable affliction, and siphon life to your targets, ramping up your damage profile, while other classes are already finishing their burst windows and moving on with their lives. By the time your DOTs reach their maximum effectiveness, the pack is dead, and you're moving to the next pull where you get to start this process over again. Congratulations on your methodical approach to damage. I'm sure it'll pay off eventually, maybe in the next expansion, but here's where it gets truly embarrassing. Affliction can't even compare with the output of Demonology and Destruction Warlocks. Your own class's other specializations are dramatically outperforming you to the point where bringing an Affliction Warlock Warlock instead of switching to Destruction is essentially griefing your group. The community consensus throughout Dragonflight was that Affliction hasn't had much luck this expansion, which is the kind of understatement that suggests the person saying it is trying very hard to be diplomatic about a catastrophic failure. Affliction also inherits all the general Warlock problems that have existed for years: poor mobility, long and easily interruptible cast times, a lack of relevant utility compared to other ranged DPS, an overall outdated toolkit that hasn't evolved in line with other classes. And then, on top of these baseline inadequacies, Affliction adds its own spec-specific problems like DOT management and content, where nothing lives long enough for DOTs to matter. You are playing the worst specialization of an already struggling class, which is a level of commitment to suffering that borders on masochistic. The low Mythic Plus representation isn't just a number, it's a community verdict. Nobody wants to suffer through playing Affliction Warlock because the effort to reward ratio is completely inverted. You work harder than most specs to achieve results that are worse than everyone else, and the only people who stick with it are those who have an emotional attachment to the spec from better times. Times that, frankly, are becoming increasingly difficult to remember. Next up is Frost Death Knight. Frost Death Knight is a melee DPS specialization that deals direct damage through hard-hitting obliterates and frost strikes while managing killing machine procs and Pillar of Frost burst windows, theoretically excelling in both single target and cleave scenarios. The Frost Death Knight is, according to its own class guides, rather famous for its lacking of mobility. This is a fascinating way to describe what is functionally a crippling weakness in a game where every encounter is designed around movement mechanics. You are famous for being slow. This is like being famous for showing up late. It's not the kind of recognition that improves your job prospects. The core problem with Frost Death Knight is its dependency on Breath of Sindragosa, a channeled ability that becomes your only viable form of DPS output. Let me be clear about how ridiculous this is. You are a melee class. Your class fantasy involves wielding massive two-handed weapons or dual-wielding one-handed weapons to cleave through enemies in close combat, and your optimal damage rotation revolves around standing still and breathing ice at things. Forum posts consistently ask, why is an ice breath my only viable form of DPS? And the answer is that Blizzard designed Frost Death Knight this way, and then forgot to fix it. The spec is highly dependent on this cooldown to the point where it can't shine until fundamental issues are addressed, which is a polite way of saying the spec is broken and nobody cares enough to repair it. Frost Death Knight was competing with Survival Hunter, Arcane Mage, and Affliction Warlock for the title of Worst DPS Specialization during Dragonflight Season 2. This is not good company. These are the specs that other specs use as cautionary tales. One forum post declared that Frost Death Knight's next patch are going to be the worst spec in the history of WoW, which is hyperbolic but not entirely inaccurate given the trajectory. The Mythic Plus representation is abysmal, despite the spec theoretically having good damage numbers in simulations, which tells you everything you need to know about the gap between theory and practice. But here's where it gets truly absurd. Players are respecting from Frost to Blood Death Knight because they can do more DPS as a tank than as a dedicated damage specialization. Read that again. The tank spec, whose primary role is to absorb damage and maintain threat, outputs more damage than Frost in practical scenarios. One player stated outright, may as well just switch to Blood DK, which I find boring. But hey, I'd be doing more DPS and not dying as a result. Your survivability is so poor that players are switching to the specialization designed for not dying in order to not die, and they're dealing more damage in the process. Other players are abandoning Frost entirely for Survival Hunter, a spec we've already established is historically terrible. One forum post read, now I'm just going to Survival Hunter instead because I can button mash and do nearly twice the DPS button mashing. On Survival Hunter, for twice your damage, you have lost the DPS race to someone who isn't even trying, piloting a spec that exists primarily as a punchline. The Frost Death Knight has theoretically the best defensive profile in the game, tied with Unholy Death Knight for passive survivability, and yet players are still dying constantly because you can't survive mechanics you can't move out of. You're famous for being slow in a game about movement. Truly inspiring. Next up is Survival Hunter. Survival Hunter is a melee DPS specialization that abandoned the ranged weapon fantasy to engage enemies in close combat using a combination of traps, explosives, and coordinated strikes with your pet. Since the beginning of Dragonflight, Survival Hunter has been seen as the worst specialization in the game due to its lack of survivability, damage, and utility. The irony of a spec called Survival having no survivability is apparently lost on Blizzard, who continues to let this bizarre experiment persist despite the community's complete rejection of the concept. You are named after your ability to survive, and yet you die more frequently than cloth-wearing casters who have the good sense to stay at range. The melee hunter concept is fundamentally flawed because beast mastery and marksmanship exist. These are ranged specializations. They use ranged weapons. They maintain distance from enemies. They perform better than you in every measurable way. Beast mastery is, according to community consensus, the foolproof ranged version with the ludicrous mobility of a melee class, which means it has all of your mobility advantages with none of your crippling weaknesses. Marksmanship is simply better at dealing damage, which is ostensibly your only job. The fact that you get flack from other players for not playing marksmanship tells you everything you need to know about how the community views your spec choice. Survival Hunter is what happens when a design team has an idea during Legion and then refuses to admit it was a mistake for the next 8 years. It's been described as a bizarre experiment that hasn't been properly accepted by Hunter players, short of the few times where it was just broken OP. You are a failed experiment that occasionally becomes overpowered due to tuning errors, at which point players briefly tolerate your existence before you're nerfed back to irrelevance. The low player count isn't because the spec is difficult or requires specialized knowledge. It's because nobody wants to play a melee hunter when ranged hunters exist and are objectively superior. During Dragonflight Season 2, 4 different specializations were actively competing to replace Survival Hunter as the worst spec in the game. Affliction Warlock, Assassination Rogue, Arcane Mage, and Frost Death Knight all had such low representation in Mythic Plus dungeons that they were well underway to dethrone Survival Hunters. And yet, despite 4 different specs making a legitimate case for being worse than you, Survival Hunter remained the baseline comparison. You are the unit of measurement. You are the standard by which other terrible specs are judged. When players want to express that their spec is struggling, they say we might be worse than Survival Hunter, which is the most damning thing you can say about class balance. The community consensus is that you're just playing the wrong spec. Not that survival needs buffs, not that the design needs adjustments. The consensus is that you should switch to marksmanship or beast mastery and stop subjecting yourself to this. The fact that better options exist within your own class makes your continued existence as a survival hunter remain either admirably stubborn or genuinely baffling. Marksmanship is right there. Beast mastery is right there. They are better than you. I don't know what to tell you. Next up is Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman is a melee DPS specialization that imbues weapons with elemental power to deliver devastating strikes enhanced by Maelstrom weapon procs and Stormstrike burst windows. Enhancement Shaman is also, alongside Retribution Paladin, one of the 2 original meme specs in World of Warcraft history. This designation has persisted across multiple expansions, private servers, and classic iterations because Enhancement's fundamental problems have never been adequately addressed. You are not just bad. You are historically, legendarily, catastrophically bad, and your badness has been documented and mocked for over 20 years. The rotation, if we can generously call it that, consists primarily of auto-attacking while waiting for Stormstrike to come off its 12-second cooldown. One player described Enhancement Shamans in vanilla as auto-attacking with a Stormstrike every 12 seconds, which is only slightly better than vanilla Enhancement Shaman, where you didn't get to Stormstrike at all because of the lower amount of debuff slots. Your gameplay improvement over the course of World of Warcraft's development has been gaining access to one button every 12 seconds. Extraordinary, I know. But here's where Enhancement Shaman's reputation truly cements itself. You are not brought to raids for your damage output. You are brought for Windfury Totem. The guild will attempt to force the Nightfall Axe onto you, a weapon with a proc that increases spell damage for your raid members, because your personal DPS contribution is so negligible that you're more valuable as a walking buff bot. One player's experience report stated plainly, the most important thing you need to understand if you choose one of these specs is the guild will try to force the Nightfall Axe onto you. You are not a damage dealer, you are a totem delivery system that occasionally swings a debuff stick. The comparison to other melee specs is genuinely humiliating. Replace most of your melee DPS with Enhancement Shamans, and I guarantee the game gets much harder. Replace them with Feral Druids, and it's harder, but still realistic. You lose to Feral Druid in every meaningful comparison, and we've already established that Feral Druids are performing a complex rotation for middling results. Enhancement has been described as the worst DPS spec in the game by a good margin, and this assessment comes from communities actively trying to make the spec viable through custom server modifications. Even when people are trying to fix you, you remain broken. There's also a spectacular identity crisis happening with Enhancement's design. You are a melee specialization that scales with spell power. You spend mana despite being in melee range. How did you manage to have mana problems as a melee class? Casters have mana problems because they're casting spells from from range with the safety of distance. You are in melee range, taking damage, and somehow you're also running out of mana. The removal of mana cost from Judgment and Seals was suggested as a solution for Ret Paladins. You can't even get that level of consideration because nobody cares enough about enhancement to theorize fixes. The most damning statement about Enhancement Shaman comes from a progression discussion. It is literally possible to prog with 12 Enhancement Shamans in your raid. Getting 28 other people to agree to progressing through raid content with 12 Enhancement Shamans is another story. You are technically functional. Mechanically, the game allows you to complete content. Socially, nobody will ever agree to bring you because you make everything harder for no benefit beyond Windfree Totem, which one Enhancement Shaman can provide. You are kept alive solely because someone needs to drop totems, and that someone might as well be you since you're not doing anything else useful. And now we arrive at Retribution Paladin. Retribution Paladin is a melee DPS specialization that wields two-handed weapons to deliver holy judgment through abilities like Templar's Verdict, Divine Storm, and various seal effects while managing holy power as a resource. Retribution Paladin is also the single most legendary meme spec in World of Warcraft's entire 20-year history. This is not hyperbole. This is not recency bias. Retribution Paladin has been objectively terrible since vanilla, remained terrible through classic, continued being terrible in private server reworks, and persists in being either catastrophically underpowered or awkwardly overtuned with no middle ground. You are not just playing a bad spec. You are playing a cultural phenomenon of badness that has transcended the game itself. In vanilla and classic WoW, Retribution Paladins were brought to raids as buff bots or healers. Ret was not relevant. One player summarized the community consensus perfectly. They are by far the most useless class/spec for raiding. They literally bring nothing but shit DPS. No Ret buffs, no debuffs, just shit DPs. This is not an outlier opinion. This is the documented historical record. When players asked, did Ret Paladins really suck in WoW vanilla? The response was universally, yes, obviously. How is this even a question? You were benched for literally anything with a pulse. Warriors, rogues, a multi-box character that occasionally presses buttons. Anything was preferable to bringing a Retribution Paladin for their damage output. The rotation in vanilla was essentially auto-attacking. You would swing your two-handed weapon and wait for Seal of Command to proc, which it did based on a percentage chance that you had no control over. This is not a rotation. This is prayer-based gameplay. You are hoping that the game's RNG decides you get to do damage today. Players who insisted on playing Ret despite this were told to make their own guild, with the understanding that they would never clear raids. Just don't get unrealistic expectations of ever clearing a raid if you resort to making your own guild running a meme. Spec was the actual advice given to aspiring Ret players. Season of Discovery, Blizzard's attempt to reimagine Classic with new abilities and playstyles, somehow made Retribution Paladin even worse. The logs confirmed Ret as the worst spec in the entire game, mainly due to developers forcing a Shockhaden hybrid spec that was in no way functional and wasn't supported by any of the talent trees. Everyone tried to make it clear how terrible Paladin runes were. Nobody listened. The spec launched broken and stayed broken. Players quit over the state of Ret because even in a version of WoW designed to fix historical mistakes, Retribution Paladin remained unfixable. Private servers like Turtle WoW have attempted extensive reworks to make Ret viable. These reworks include removing mana costs from core abilities, changing seal mechanics, adding group-wide damage auras, and fundamentally redesigning talents. And despite all of this effort, one community assessment reads, that entire Turtle WoW Paladin rework is a meme, because retry is still crap when it comes to PvE and absolute god when it comes to PvP. You are so broken that even when people are actively trying to fix you with custom code and unlimited design freedom, you remain either terrible or accidentally overpowered with no functional middle ground. In current retail WoW, the War Within expansion features Herald of the Sun as a hero talent tree for Retribution. The community consensus is that Herald of the Sun has been weak throughout the entire TWW season, largely because the tree is clearly designed around Holy Paladin and awkwardly forced onto Ret. 20 years later, Blizzard is still designing Paladin systems that don't work for Retribution and then acting surprised when Ret players are unhappy. Meanwhile, PvP players are posting threads titled Nerf Ret Paladin, claiming the spec is too easy to play and does too much damage, which is genuinely hilarious considering Ret has been garbage in PoE for 2 decades. You have spent 20 years as a meme. You are the original. You are the template. Every other meme spec is measured against your legendary inadequacy. Enhancement Shaman was terrible alongside you. But Retribution Paladin, you have transcended being merely bad. You are institutionally, historically, culturally terrible, and this status has persisted across expansions, versions, and custom server implementations. Congratulations on your consistency. In conclusion, World of Warcraft's class balance has been an ambitious disaster for over 2 decades, and you should absolutely play them. If you enjoyed this PowerPoint presentation, I made others, and you should absolutely check them out. Peace on planet Earth.